Welcome back to the channel in the southern Philippines, and today we are going to be talking about part 2 of how my life was different here in the Philippines than it was back in the United States. This is obviously personal to me. It's not going to apply to every American, but it's what people in the poll voted that they wanted to see by overwhelming numbers. So going back in part 1, in the previous video, we covered bathrooms, food, environment and the weather, privacy, and critters. In this part 2 video, we're going to be covering housing, possessions, daily routine, transportation, and some of the bad things of the Philippines. So let's jump right in and get started with the first topic. Housing is the first big difference in this video that we're going to talk about between my life in the United States and here in the Philippines. Now, you can buy and rent all kinds of different houses in the United States, same as the Philippines. This one's very unique to my situation, but I'll kind of show you and let you look at what I was doing in the United States. So for the last decade, I had owned a 3-bedroom house sitting on 3 acres of land in a subdivision in the United States. It was massive. It had a 3-car garage. It had a full basement underneath the top 2 floors. It had a living room. It had a library. It had a dining room. It had a very, very large kitchen and a bedroom that you could probably land an aircraft in. So it was huge and it was spacious and it was completely unneeded. It was, I found that I didn't even use most of the space in the house. Basically, I would use the bedroom to sleep in. I would use the library to do work, to read, to watch a little TV, and use the kitchen to cook and to eat in. That was it. That's basically the 3 rooms in the house that I used. The rest of it was pretty well a waste of space for me. And it was also a pain in the tail to clean because you would have to dust all of the time. You never could get caught up on it. And it was just way too much space, especially as my children started going away to college and we didn't have them in the house anymore. It just was too much space. So now I have moved into a 3-bedroom house that I'm renting in the Philippines, which is much smaller. Literally, my master bedroom, living room now, and probably one of the other bedrooms is as big as my master bedroom in the United States. It was just ridiculously too much space and too much space to work with. So that doesn't bother me at all. I'm actually very happy. That is a regret. I do have no regrets of getting rid of my house there. I have no regrets in downsizing from that. It has been a blessing, to be honest with you. The only thing that I miss about that house or my lifestyle there was the privacy of having all of those woods around me. That was really, really nice. And I could get that again. I could get that here in the Philippines. It's just I would have to go find that and I would have to pay for that. But how I'm living right now compared to how I was living in the United States. So the main big things about the housing that is different is in the United States we had central heat and air. And I don't know if such a thing exists here in the Philippines. I've never been in a single house or place that I have seen central heat and air residential. They may have that. Most of the time people are using split air conditioning units on a room by room basis, or they're using window air conditioners if they're using air conditioners at all. As far as heating goes, I seriously doubt there's a heating system anywhere here in the Philippines. If I'm wrong, leave a comment below and tell me. I know I've heard some places that are cooler in the Philippines, but I can't imagine anybody would be actually heating their house here in the Philippines. The other big thing that I have that it's different now was the kitchen setup as far as housing goes. So I had a really big kitchen with islands and everything. Really loved to cook, absolutely loved to cook. That was one of my therapeutic hobbies in the United States. And I'd learned to cook when I was like 10 years old. It was also in the Boy Scouts, so we had to cook whenever we'd go out camping multiple times a year, and later on when I just camped recreationally. So I always loved to cook growing up. And when I was an adult, I cooked for myself, rarely ate out. very rarely ate out. Whereas here, the kitchen setup is much different. I don't have all those big indoor ovens and everything else. We do have an oven in the place that I'm staying, although I don't believe we've used it even one time. And it's a gas oven rather than an electric oven that we would have had in the United States. We have a split system here to where we have an inside kitchen and we have an outside, what you call dirty kitchen. And the outside kitchen is where we do most of the cooking. Because again, we're cooking with gas or with fire or with charcoal. And so most of that is done either in the dirty kitchen or outside, right outside of the dirty kitchen. And they do that here in the Philippines, one, to prevent heat from getting into the main part of the household, but also they cook with a lot of fish and other things that could just smell up the entire house. That keeps those odors and things outside of the house, so it's still pleasant in the inside. Hey, if you're enjoying this, make sure you subscribe if you want to see part 3 or any other videos from me in the future. And hit the like button so other people can find this material that are interested in it. Really helps YouTube push this video out to people that are similarly situated than you and that actually want to see this type of content. Thanks, guys. Possessions and stuff. This has absolutely nothing to do with differences between America and the Philippines. It's me personally, my life in America versus the Philippines. Before I decided to sell everything and to leave, I had ungodly amounts of junk, quite frankly. Now, I had collected a library, so I had thousands of books. I had 2 libraries. Actually, I had one at home, and I also had one at my offices because I was a lawyer. I had a law library. And so I had thousands of different books in my library at the house. I had a very big private library so I had to get rid of all of those things. And I would never have those kind of books here in the Philippines just because you're not going to be under constant temperature control in the Philippines. Those books the paper in those are not going to hold up very well. You really do have to have a good temperature controlled environment. So I have very few books here in the Philippines. I only have like maybe 5. I like to read, so I'm always rotating through those. And then usually when I get done with them, I give them away to somebody, or I'll leave them at a hotel so that the next person can come find those. So I downsized everything that I owned in the United States, of books, of CDs, of DVDs, of my firearm collection, and got rid of everything to where I was basically down to 2 suitcases and a backpack. And that's basically what I brought here to the Philippines. And with the exception of getting some furniture, because I needed a bed, I needed a chair, I needed a desk to work at, that's still pretty much all that I've got. I've got very, very few minimal possessions, and I would never go back to having all of that stuff. It's almost criminal. You've got all this stuff that you just never use. Things that I hadn't used in 10, 15, 20 years that I was getting rid of. And that has been a lifestyle change that is so freeing. It's hard to do when you're getting rid of it, but once you have, you are no longer a slave to your possessions. And it's been one of the most wonderful things after I got it done that has happened to me, really, in the last many decades of my life. So, my daily routine is much different in the Philippines than it was in the United States. Most of the work I did in the United States was done between 7 a.m. in the morning and 5 p.m. in the afternoon, as far as meeting with clients, going to court, just telephone calls, working in general. So now any interaction with people that I have in the United States, because that's where my main business is in the United States, is done in the evening in the Philippines. Because when it's 8 o'clock here at night in the Philippines, right now, Eastern Standard Time, it's 8 o'clock in the morning. And that's when the courts are open and I'm talking to clerks in the United States, or I'm talking to other attorneys in the United States, or I'm talking to clients in the United States, or other people that I'm supervising as far as getting stuff done. So my work hours basically any work that I end up doing is going to be in the evening. It's going to be 7 o'clock to midnight. I'm not doing that stuff during the day. So it's basically a shift. And again, that's because my business that I own is in the United States. Obviously, I don't own or work or have anything in the Philippines. So I'm working on that time zone rather than here. Also, my daily life is a lot different in that I'm outdoors a lot more than I was in the United States. Basically, my life in the United States is I lived in my house, I lived in my offices, I lived in my car, I lived at court when I was working. So I really was not out and about in the outdoors unless I was doing some sort of outdoor activity. Whereas here in the Philippines, I'm almost always out. I mean, if I'm going to the mall, I'm going to be in the outdoors getting there. If I'm going to go out to eat, I'm going to go out to a restaurant, and many of the restaurants that I'm going to be eating at here in the Philippines are outside or they're open air restaurants, which is much different than what we would have in the United States. They do have some open air restaurants, in the areas that I lived, but that's more of an exception than it is a rule like it is here in the Philippines. So just much more exposed to the outside in the daily routine. My daily routine is much slower here in the Philippines because just the way society works here. So in the United States, we're always in a hurry. Boom, 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 boom. You go to some place. Everybody's trying to get the work done for you as quick as possible so they can move on to the next customer. It's not so much like that in the Philippines. So, I spend a lot more time in the Philippines waiting in line than I would in the United States. Again, it's a much slower pace. So if I'm going to go to the grocery store here in the Philippines, I have to allot probably an extra half hour to an hour just to deal with lines and slow as far as the checkouts go. It doesn't bother me. It's just something that I have to take into the equation in my daily routine. Whereas in the United States, it would be very rare that I would have to wait in line that long. Also, dealing with government offices in the Philippines is going to be generally more of a wait time than it would be in the United States. Although, I will say, that was changing the last probably year that I was in the United States after everything else was happening in the world. So again, it's just a slower pace because there's more waiting in lines and things. I've spent a lot more time in the outdoors compared to what my life was like in the United States. That's probably much more unique to me, more so than it is just America and the Philippines, but that's my perspective on it. Transportation. Okay, this is kind of a broad topic, but in the United States, we are very much a car culture, much more so than is here in the Philippines. There are tons of cars here in the Philippines. A lot of people drive here in the Philippines. Many of my family have cars here in the Philippines and SUVs and things that they drive, but it's not necessarily all of the time. In the United States, if you don't have a car, other than some major cities, that you're just not going to be a really effective part of society because we live so far apart. Whereas in the Philippines, things are still based around towns, even in the provinces. So there are public transportation that you can get to the grocery store, you can get to, go out to eat, you can go over to a friend's house, you can come back to your place, and that's available. Much more so than it is, say, in the rural areas in the United States. Another big difference transportation-wise in the United States, and the best way to describe this is, in the United States, unlike much of the world, we really do not live in time. We live in space. And the best way to describe that is the United States is so big and we are so spread out. And although, yes, we have big cities just like everywhere else, the amount of commute time because of distance that we spend in the United States. For instance, somebody would live in the suburbs, but they would commute into the city to work. So they're living within that space. They're 60 miles away from home, an hour away, rather than living minute by minute by minute. that's probably a terrible way to explain it, but we spend so much more time in our vehicles just commuting and going to different places than you do in the Philippines. And again, that's a lot of it because it's based around living in a city in the Philippines, much like it is in Europe, compared to the United States, where we're much more spread out. For the most part, again, if you're in New York City or something like that, it's going to be completely different, but that's a huge difference here, to my life at least. Finally, dealing with what I will call the bad things of the Philippines. So I knew all this when I came to the Philippines. I was expecting these things. I had planned for them. In fact, some of them I thought might have made the Philippines unworkable for what I have to do in order to make a living. Turned out that those things had changed to the point that we could stay. But one of them is going to be brownouts. And so in the Philippines, depending upon where you live, there are going to be times where the electricity is turned off. Sometimes it's planned, sometimes it's unplanned. So, and it may happen everywhere in the Philippines. I haven't been to every place in the Philippines, but I've heard anecdotal evidence. So in the place that I'm living, the brownouts have been actually fairly minimal. I would say it happens at least 3 times a week. At least 3 times a week. Sometimes it's planned and it's told in advance. It usually is in the evenings around midnight. For most people, I guess that's not a problem because they're going to be in bed anyway. For me, that may be I'm communicating with the court system back in the United States, so I had to have backup plans for that. So when the electricity goes off, in some places, they'll have day-long brownouts. That doesn't happen where I'm at least it has not happened in the 3 months that I've been here. When we researched this area, we were told that that was going to be very minimal by people who actually lived in this area. And realistically, the longest one I've had so far was 2 hours. And again, we do have them at least 3 times a week. Sometimes it's only for 5 minutes, which is probably more of a weather issue. So that's one bad thing that you have to deal with. Where in the United States, the only time I had to deal with that was in snowstorms, which is quite frequently in the winter that we'd lose power. And there we'd lose power for anywhere from an hour to 3 days. So it's not all roses in the West either. In addition, I lived in a very lightning-prone area in the United States, so during the spring, especially April and May, sometimes early June, we would have power outages due to storm activity. And again, those would last an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. They weren't planned brownouts because of overusing capacity and so forth, but that did happen in the United States too. It was actually more unpredictable in the United States where I lived than it is here. But the particular area I live in, not been that much of a problem, been able to plan for it, been able to have backups as far as having phones so that I could use it for internet if I needed it during those time periods so that I can keep getting stuff done to make myself an income back in the United States. The second bad thing we'll say about the Philippines is noise pollution, and that is a big deal. The reason it's a big deal for me is because if I'm on a conference call with a judge and another attorney in the United States planning out a hearing that we're going to have for sometime next year or at the end of this year, then having a bunch of karaoke music coming off that's blaring is incredibly unprofessional. Now, I've got microphones that are going to cancel out noise and things, but you can't always get all of it canceled out. And so that's a big problem. So that can be planned in the Philippines so that you don't necessarily experience those things as bad as you would in some others. So there are plenty of communities in like Davao, for instance, to where there are homeowners' rules that you can't be having gigantic roosters crowing and block parties, at midnight. Those things just aren't tolerated. Those are more expensive, more upscale neighborhoods. Still very affordable in my book, but for some people maybe not. But so you can go into one of those places and make your home if you're going to be working in the evenings out of your home or you're going to be communicating and that's important. Or you can try to soundproof the places that you're at. But the noise pollution is something that has to be dealt with and that you have to take into account. Again, it's not a game changer, at least it's not for me. For some people, they complain constantly about those things. I think you don't like it, move to a different area where you're not going to have those problems. But you do need to plan for it. So when you are going in to live in a place, you need to find out, you need to talk to people, you need to actually be at that place at different times during the day so you know what's going on. Because if they're going to be running a jackhammer 24/7 while you're trying to do work that's going to require you to have noise reduction, then that's not going to work for you. So that's everything that we've covered in part 2. Again, a lot of this stuff is unique to me, but I don't know how to talk about my life in America, difference between that and the Philippines without actually making it personal and talking about the stuff of how it actually affects me. So next one, the last one that we're going to have is going to be part 3. It's the one that everybody keeps asking about, which is going to be about costs. And if you'll tune in tomorrow, actually we'll tune in Tuesday. We'll wait one day and then we'll get that posted and out to you on Tuesday. Thanks.